Yet that stance, too, was not without some justification. The Royalists in 1796 and 1797 may have been prepared to operate like a political party within the Constitution, but their long-term aim was undoubtedly to overthrow it and bring in the king. That king, in turn, was explicitly committed to the reversal of everything done since June 1789. As for the Jacobins, they may have been sincere in professions, increasingly heard in 1799, that they were merely a party of honest Democrats, legitimately organized to oppose those in power by constitutional means. If so, they were rash in the extreme to revert constantly to the rhetoric of the year number 2, to keep green the memory of Babeuf and lend vocal support to more radical elements in the sister republics. All this raised understandable fears that their true loyalty was still to the leveling Constitution of 1793, and nothing in their attitude or that of the Royalists suggests that once in power either would have been more tolerant of the opposition than the Directory was. Neither had any interest in compromise or conciliation. Neither was prepared to recognize the good faith and legitimate interest of opponents. The difficulties plaguing the Directory then were far from simply constitutional. And the Constitution of the year number 8, drafted within a month under relentless pressure from Bonaparte, did little to address them. What it did was give a plenitude of power to the executive, which left no excuse for not confronting the deep and still unresolved problems created by the revolution. At the base of the political system, all citizens were now allowed to vote for those among them who they believed most suitable to conduct public affairs. But this merely meant a tenth of their own number, who would then constitute a communal list. The latter, in turn, chose a tenth of themselves to constitute a departmental list. From them, a further tenth were chosen for the national list of citizens eligible for national office. This included membership of the legislature. The choice of members would be made by a new institution, the Senate, whose powers were not otherwise defined in the 95 articles of this laconic Constitution. But CS had long believed in the desirability of a conservative power to vet the legality of the state's activities. In 1795, he had proposed a constitutional jury to perform these functions, but without success. Now, with the Senate, the idea was adopted, and he became the body's first president. The legislature itself would remain bicameral, but whereas the lower house, the 100-member tribunate, was to discuss all proposed legislation, it could not vote it. The upper house, the 300-member legislative body, did the voting, but could not discuss. Neither had any initiative in legislation. Draft laws came from the government alone and were to be elaborated in a council of state. A revival of a key institution of the old monarchy. Most of these provisions emanated from CS. His ideas on the executive, however, were not adopted. Here, at last, General Bonaparte showed his true hand. CS' initial proposal was for an executive of 2 councils. One for internal and one for external affairs. They would be appointed, along with other members of the state apparatus, by a supreme officer, the Grand Elector, holding office for life, but exercising no other authority. A sort of constitutional monarch, in effect. Bonaparte was envisaged in this role, but from the start, he made it clear that he had no intention of being what he called a fatted pig. He wanted real power, and in the final version, he got it. There would be 3 consuls, as since 10th November, but the first among them would have the overriding authority. Nobody doubted who it would be. Completion of the new Constitution was announced on 15 December. There was no referring back, as originally promised, to the former legislative councils. It was to be approved by plebiscite. And for the revolutionary month of Nivelles, 21st December 1799 through 20th of January 1800. Registers were open in every commune for citizens to record their approval or opposition. The result, announced early in February, gave 3,111,007 in favor and 1,562 against. Some 6 million did not vote at all, and creative methods were used to swell the numbers accepting. Yet it scarcely mattered, the Constitution was brought into force in anticipation of popular acceptance on 25th December. It was, claimed its authors, based on the true principle of representative government and on the sacred rights of property, equality, and liberty. The powers which it sets up will be strong and stable, as they must be, in order to guarantee the rights of citizens and the interests of the state. Citizens, the revolution is established on the principles with which it began. It is over. The effrontery in this statement was to become all too familiar over the 15 years during which Bonaparte was to rule France. Only a handful of mutilated relics of the principles of 1789 could be discerned in the terse and ambiguous clauses of the consular constitution. And the first consul was certainly not the first person to declare that the revolution was over. By this time it was, or would be, once the stability also promised became a reality. That depended on a satisfactory resolution of the issues which for a decade had torn France apart. Within 2 years they had been resolved, and for years afterwards, most of the citizens of France thought a little effrontery and the sacrifice of most of the principles of 1789 a small price to pay. Many of the most serious problems of the revolutionary France arose from the fact that for most of the 1790s it was a country at war. Even the peace of 1789 had not included the most dogged enemy of all, Great Britain. Few experienced statesmen expected continental peace to last long either. Eventually, renewed war had brought a soldier to power. The most important task facing him was to end it, and end it victoriously. If France was defeated, he could hardly hope to survive to do anything else. As 1799 came to an end, matters were already drifting his way. The greed and duplicity of the Austrians had placed intolerable strains on a coalition whose armies, by any rational calculation, ought now to have been marching deep into France. But instead of supporting his Russian allies in Switzerland, Thuggett diverted the Archduke Charles with the best Austrian troops north to the Rhine, while in Italy his aim was to establish Austrian control of territories Suvorov had won rather than drive the last of the French back over the Alps. Suvorov's impressive but strategically disastrous retreat through Switzerland in the autumn of 1799, combined with the failure of the Anglo-Russian invasion of the Batavian Republic left the volatile Paul I believing he had been betrayed by both his main allies in the coalition. But by the beginning of 1800, he had resolved to withdraw and ordered his troops home. The first consul used the opportunity to propose peace to Francis II and George III, but only on the terms of Campo Formio, that brilliant but unstable triumph. Spurned, as he must have known he would be, he prepared to resume the campaign with a blow against Austria, similar to that planned in 1796, with armies striking towards Vienna simultaneously from the Rhine and northern Italy, this time in overall control. Like the directors before him, he realized that the Italian theater should be secondary. But Moreau, commanding on the Rhine, thought the thrust proposed there too bold, and Bonaparte was still not secure enough in power to override him. He therefore decided to stake everything on repeating his own triumphs of 1796 and 1797 in Italy. After building up troops and supplies in eastern France in great secrecy, at the end of April 1800, he crossed the Alps from Switzerland. On 2nd June, he re-entered Milan, a few days after the French besieged in Genoa since the previous summer surrendered. This meant that when he confronted the Austrians at Marengo on the 14th, they had no distractions elsewhere, and he was outnumbered and outgunned. Accordingly, he nearly lost the battle. Only fresh reserves at the last minute saved him. But instead of regrouping to fight another day, his opponents promptly sued for an armistice, under which they evacuated the whole of Lombardy and Liguria. So the first consul was able to claim another triumph, and an armistice was soon concluded on the Rhine as well. Once more, France offered peace, but the terms were the same, and the Austrians believed themselves strong enough to achieve better ones. In November, fighting resumed, and this time the first consul was strong enough to insist on a knockout blow through Germany. It was delivered by Moreau at Hohenlinden, just outside Munich on 3rd December. By Christmas, the fighting was over, and negotiations began in earnest. The result was the Treaty of Lunéville, expedited by the fall of Thugut after the defeats of the summer. It was signed on 9 February 1801. Not only did it confirm the settlement of Campo Formio, with its recognition of Belgium and the left bank of the Rhine as French, and the establishment of French sister republics in northern Italy, it also, while confirming the Austrian hold in Venetia, expelled the Habsburgs from Tuscany, once more under French occupation. The Grand Duchy now became a kingdom, Etruria, and its monarch was to be a Bourbon, Louis I, son of the Duke of Parma, and son-in-law of the King of Spain. When the triumphant republic began creating kingdoms, and for Bourbons of all people, the end of revolution really must be in sight. Nor was the Parthenopean Republic resurrected further south. The Bourbons of Naples, who also made peace with France in March 1801, lost certain outlying territories and accepted French garrisons in key ports, but in return had their legitimacy recognized. France took more in 1801 from her longest standing ally than from her enemies. Spain, her client since 1796, ceded the vast, untracked territory of Louisiana. Spanish ministers thought the price well worth paying for reestablishing their influence, as they hoped in Italy. The effect of all these settlements was to leave Great Britain isolated once again. At sea, she was still unchallenged and unchallengeable. In the Mediterranean, British squadrons thwarted all attempts to relieve or reinforce the French garrison left in Egypt. And in January 1800, Kleber, its commander, agreed to evacuate. But nothing was done before the European successes of the spring, which encouraged the French to hold out. The first consul never quite abandoned the dream which had taken him to Egypt, even after the British landed an expedition which in March 1801 forced the surrender of the last French troops there. In September 1800, meanwhile, they had also expelled the French from Malta. Its capture completed the alienation of Paul I from his former coalition allies. As Grand Master of the Knights of St. John, he still regarded the island as his by right, but he now offered full cooperation to Bonaparte and began by organizing an armed neutrality of Baltic powers to deny the tyrant of the seas access to the ports of Northern Europe. But when Denmark, controlling access to the Baltic with its vital naval supplies, joined this new league, Nelson appeared with a squadron which destroyed the Danish fleet in Copenhagen itself on 2nd April 1801. Just over a week earlier, Paul I had been assassinated in St. Petersburg, and within days, Anglo-Russian contacts resumed. By then, however, nobody in London was looking for yet another coalition when Bonaparte had proposed peace in December 1799, the lofty British response had been to demand a prior restoration of the Bourbons. A year on, they could no longer afford such disdain. France was once more in complete control of the continent, and intense war weariness was compounded by economic difficulties to create a new wave of domestic discontent. Ireland, legally united with England in 1801, was still very uncertainly pacified. Yet, George III had set his face against the measure Pitt thought most likely to expedite that pacification: the admission of Catholics to Parliament. On this pretext, Pitt, the most tenacious of all the French Revolution's enemies, resigned in February 1801. Within days, his successor, Addington, was sending out peace feelers to Paris. Bonaparte responded at once, and a summer of negotiations was concluded, and preliminaries signed in October. The terms which at last brought the wars of the French Revolution to an end were an unqualified triumph for France. The Republic made no substantial concessions at all of gains made through her control of the seas. Great Britain retained only Ceylon and Trinidad, the first at the expense of the Dutch, the second at that of Spain. The Cape was returned to that Batavian Republic, and the evacuation of Malta promised. It was true that the French agreed to evacuate Egypt, but the British even provided the ships for that. British attempts to secure a follow-up commercial agreement or compensation for the deposed stadtholder of the King of Piedmont were brushed aside. There was no explicit British recognition of the Swiss or Italian sister republics, or the annexation of Belgium, which they had originally gone to war to prevent. But the very act of negotiation was a tacit acknowledgement. The explosion of jubilation throughout England when the preliminaries were renounced muted most criticism of these humiliating terms. Accordingly, they were enshrined in the final peace signed at Amiens on 25 March 1802. It was a month short of 10 years since revolutionary France had turned to war as an instrument of policy. The vicissitudes of that decade of conflict had transformed the country far more radically than the principles of 1789 had promised to do, and they had transformed much of the rest of Western Europe too. Few could have dreamed in April 1792 that at the end of it all, France would have extended her frontiers to the Rhine and the crest of the Alps, and would be in complete control of a blanket of client territories stretching from the North Sea to the Adriatic. Whether or not the effort had been worthwhile or even necessary, the outcome was certainly glorious. And Bonaparte made sure that he got most of the credit. It is not sufficiently realized, he told a Prussian diplomat in July 1800, that the French Revolution is not finished so long as the scourge of war lasts. This revolution could still disturb, upset, and overthrow many states in its course. I want peace as much to settle the present French government as to save the world from chaos. In the event, this peace did not last long, and chaos would soon be extended to areas of Europe scarcely touched in the 1790s. But that was largely the work of the Emperor Napoleon, rather than the revolution through which he had climbed to power. Even before war had engulfed the revolution, French opinion had been polarized over the question of the king. The first major consequence of the war was the creation of a republic. But that proved just as contentious as the rule of Louis XVI. Within weeks of the king's execution, monarchist rebels began a civil war in the West, which was never fully won and seemed on the verge of breaking out afresh in 1799. When allowed to express themselves freely, as in the elections of 1797, massive numbers of French citizens indicated that they preferred a king to the republic. Many more would willingly have accepted a restoration if it would bring calmer times, or if the king would recognize and guarantee some of the earlier achievements of the revolution. Much of France, therefore, hoped and expected at the end of 1799 that the first consul would be the Bourbons' General Monk, standing aside once his military authority had stabilized the government in favor of the legitimate ruler. The pretender himself cherished such hopes. On 20th of February, 1800, Louis XVIII wrote in flattering terms to the victor of Lodi, of Castiglione, of Arcoli, the conqueror of Italy and Egypt, urging him to seize the ultimate glory by restoring the dynasty which alone could ensure France's tranquility. Bonaparte proved in no hurry to reply. Until military victory had consolidated his power, he had every interest in neutralizing monarchist opinion by keeping up its hopes. But at the same time, he moved resolutely to cut off the sources of royalism's strength. The greatest immediate threat came from the Chouans, who had become active again only weeks before he took power. Yet his very arrival in power disconcerted them, and one by one the various Chouan leaders began to make peace. He, in turn, was prepared to be generous, reminding the Western departments in a proclamation of 28 December that freedom of worship was guaranteed under the new Constitution, and that the notorious law of hostages of the previous summer had been repealed. He also arranged to meet some of the most prominent Chouan leaders and urged them to rally him. The Bourbons no longer have a chance, he told them. You have done everything you ought to have for them. You, good men, ally yourselves with the side of glory. A few remained unconvinced, including Cadoudal, who continued to plot with the British. But most had come to terms by the spring of 1800, and those who had not were ruthlessly tracked down. The Marengo campaign could scarcely have been fought without drawing on the 40,000 troops who only a few months before had been required to garrison the disturbed departments of the West. Success in that campaign, in turn, secured the first consul's own position within France. By 8th of September, he felt ready to reply to Louis XVIII's overtures, addressing the son of St. Louis merely as Monsieur. He told him frankly, "You must not hope for your return to France. You would have to walk over 100,000 corpses. Sacrifice your interest to the peace and happiness of France. I shall contribute with pleasure to the sweetness and tranquility of your retirement." Meanwhile, he was conciliating the émigrés. Although the new constitution forbade their return in any circumstances, the importance of this clause lay in his last sentence. The property of the émigrés is irrevocably vested in the Republic. Acquirers of such property were thereby assured that their rights were secure, a commitment that Louis XVIII had never yet made. Provided they accepted these losses. It was soon made clear to the émigrés that they were welcome to return. In March 1800, the list of émigrés was formally closed. In October, a general amnesty was declared for all who had taken up arms against the Republic. By now, many who had done even this had returned, but no action was taken against them. Simultaneously, those whom monarchists or those attracted by monarchy feared the most were systematically persecuted. The Jacobins. The pretext for the Brumaire coup had been the prevention of a Jacobin plot. And in the course of it, 62 left-wing deputies were excluded from the national representation. No conciliatory gestures were made in their direction, and the new constitution offered them no hope of ever repeating their electoral success of 1799. By the summer of 1800, Jacobin survivors, denounced by the first consul as terrorists, wretches in perpetual revolt against every form of government, assassins of 3rd September, the authors of 31st May, the conspirators of Prairial, were reduced to plotting in cafes, invariably eavesdropped on by Fouché's ubiquitous agents. But their talk was bloodthirsty enough, and always revolved around assassinating the new ruler of France. Thus, the government, at least, was not wholly surprised when, on 24 December 1800, a huge infernal machine was exploded in central Paris only moments after the first consul's carriage had passed. There were many dead and injured. Bonaparte was convinced that Jacobin plotters were responsible. In fact, it was quite the contrary. Fouché was soon able to prove that the bomb was the work of Chouans sent to Paris by Cadoudal. His master, however, was not interested. This was heaven-sent opportunity to strike at the Jacobins. There must be blood. And so there was. Sweeping aside legal formalities, Fouché rounded up 130 Jacobins whose names had been well known to the police for years, and who had grown used to arrest whenever, since 1795, the directorial pendulum had swung to the right. 4 were guillotined, 5 shot. Most of the rest were deported either to Guyana, a new penal depository, the Seychelles. None of the real culprits suffered at all for the moment, apart from those blown up in the attempt. Along with vengeance on men he hated and who hated him, however, Bonaparte had a more calculated motive. This is an opportunity, he declared to the Council of State, of which the government must take advantage. A great example is necessary to reconcile the middle classes to the Republic. He meant, of course, a republic headed by himself, and he knew that the surest way of defeating royalism was to make his own rule appear more likely than that of a king, to guarantee stability and the security of property. Thus he struck ruthlessly against the leveling heirs of Babeuf, having already cleared away the alarming legislation passed when they had been influential. The law of hostages was abrogated within 4 days of the Brumaire coup, the forced loan within 9, to be replaced by a small proportional surtax. The state's creditors were also reassured. In February 1800, 80 years of suspicion and prejudice were jettisoned with the establishment of a state bank, the Bank of France. The following August, it was announced that all the state's debts would henceforth be paid on time and in cash. Over that summer, stock in the consolidated third of the debt reorganized by Ramel in 1797 doubled in value. Tax revenues improved dramatically as a regular system of collection, reviving many effective pre-revolutionary practices, was instituted. In 1802, the year of peace, the first consul was able to proclaim a balanced budget. The underpinnings of these achievements were yet uncertain, but they were self-reinforcing. The finances of the state appeared every day to be under firmer and more responsible control. Law and order took on the same appearance. The authority of the central government in the localities was firmly established by the creation of prefects in each department. Recalling the intendants swept away in 1789, and with far wider powers than the directorial commissioners who had linked central to local authority between 1795 and 99. They confronted a situation of disorder and crime which had reached almost epidemic proportions ever since the promulgation of the Jourdan conscription law. which drove thousands of able-bodied young men into lives of banditry and crime as they fled from recruiting officers. In the South, inevitably, they joined royalist gangs harassing local officials. In the South, inevitably, they joined royalist gangs harassing local officials, tax collectors, buyers of national lands, National Guardsmen off duty, former Jacobin activists, and other hate figures. Elsewhere, they blended into roving bands of criminals, known from the way some of them tortured rich victims into submission as warmers, chauffeurs. In the first year of the consulate, as all available troops were drafted to the Rhine and Italy to confront foreign enemies, this crime wave continued unchecked. With the return of peace, not only did the pressure of conscription ease, but returning soldiers were available to enforce the will of the new centrally appointed local authorities against criminal elements. In February 1801, special criminal courts with wide powers were created to deal with brigandage. Disorder began to subside. And despite the first consul's brazen contempt for legal procedures at the level of high politics, in everyday terms, he made careful efforts to present himself as the apostle of the rule of law. Talk of endowing France with a uniform, comprehensive law code had gone on since at least the 1770s. Successive revolutionary assemblies set up commissions to work on the project, but none had brought it to fruition. Bonaparte was determined to do so. In 1800, he set up his own commission, lodged with it the papers and plans of previous ones, and pressed it ceaselessly to produce quick results. He was present himself at 57 of the 102 sessions which produced its first fruit, the Civil Code. Although not formally promulgated until 1804, preliminary drafts were circulating by the end of 1801. In all this, French citizens could admire, as they were meant to, the drive and activity which were elaborating for them a clear set of rules binding the holding and transfer of property. Neither kings nor representative assemblies had been capable of achieving so much so quickly. And by the time the code appeared, the last great doubt about the legitimacy and longevity of titles to land acquired during the Revolution had been removed by a settlement with its oldest and most implacable enemy, the Church. Nothing had done more to shatter the early revolutionary consensus than the National Assembly's inept attempt to regenerate the nation's religious life and organization. No wound of the revolutionary years went deeper or was reopened more persistently by all parties. And despite a massive, swelling revival of everyday religious practice in France from 1795 onwards, the last phase of the Directory was marked by renewed official anti-clericalism. When Pius VI died, a captive in France on 29 August 99, his traditional capital lost to him and turned into a French sister republic. It was widely assumed in Paris that he would have no successor. The Catholic Church had challenged the great nation and had lost. And though the ignorant populace might remain mired in credulity and mindless superstition, the Church, as an institution, was rapidly crumbling away to the general benefit of humanity. Bonaparte, however, had never made the mistake of underestimating either the power of religion or the resilience of the Church. Under orders in the spring of 1796 to march on Rome to avenge the murder of a Roman mob of a French envoy, he was confronted by a Spanish emissary from the pontiff. "I told him," the Spaniard reported, "if you people take it into your heads to make the Pope say the slightest thing against dogma or anything touching on it, you are deceiving yourselves, for he will never do it. You might, in revenge, sack, burn, and destroy Rome, St. Peter's, etc. But religion will remain standing in spite of your attacks. If all you wish is that the Pope urge peace in general and obedience to legitimate power, he will do so. He appeared to me captivated by this reasoning." Certainly, he continued while in Italy to treat the Pope with more restraint than the Directory had ordered. And when, earlier the next year, the Cispadane Republic was established in territories largely taken from the Holy See, he advised its founders that everything is to be done by degrees and with gentleness. Religion is to be treated like property, devoid of any personal faith. In Egypt, he even made parade of following Islam in the conviction that it would strengthen French rule. By the time he returned to Europe, it was already clear that Pope Pius VI would not, after all, be a last. Pope Pius VI would, after all, not be the last. A conclave of the scattered cardinals had been summoned, and the Austrians allowed it to meet on their new territory in Venice. There, in March 1800, a surprise candidate emerged successful. Sciaramonte, Bishop of Imola, who took the name of Pius VII. His chief claim to fame was that in a Christmas sermon of 1797, subsequently and understandably printed and distributed by the French invaders, he had declared that Christianity was not necessarily incompatible with either democracy or equality, even quoting Rousseau to reinforce his argument. Here, then, was a pope whose pragmatism might match that of France's new ruler to produce a solution to the most intractable of all problems thrown up by the revolution. Even before the conclave had begun to vote, the first consul was sending out conciliatory signals. The Directory's insistence on the observation of the revolutionary calendar's décadi rather than Sunday was quietly dropped. In December 1799, he ordered a full funeral honors for Pius VI. The next month, he was hinting to representatives of the Chouans that their religious grievances would soon be met. And once the cardinal's choice was made, he lost no time in speaking his mind. On his second entry into Milan in June 1800, he convoked the next month, he was hinting to representatives of the Chouans that their religious grievances would soon be met. And once the cardinal's choice was made, he lost no time in speaking his mind. On his second entry into Milan in June 1800, he convoked the city's clergy to the great cathedral and declared, even before Marengo was fought, "It is my firm intention that Christian, Catholic, and Roman religion shall be preserved in its entirety, that it shall be publicly performed. No society can exist without morality. There is no good morality without religion. It is a religion alone, therefore, that gives the state a firm and durable support. As soon as I am able to confer with the new Pope, I hope to have the happiness of removing every obstacle which will hinder complete reconciliation between France and the head of the Church." Immediately after the battle, he contacted Pius VII with an offer to open negotiations for a new concordat to reestablish the Church in France. The stakes were high. If the altars of France could be restored, the chief source of popular discontent with the new order would be eliminated. And if the enmity between Paris and Rome could be ended, the alliance between religion and counter-revolution, which had given such obduracy to both, could be prized again apart. The inhabitants of sister republics would be conciliated, and new French citizens in Belgium and the Rhineland could embrace the change with relief. On the other hand, the whole enterprise bristled with difficulties. Which church was to be restored? There were now two, both claiming legitimacy. both with bodies of apostolically consecrated bishops. How would bishops be appointed in the future? Would the restored church be Gallican, with all the liberties and traditions accumulated since the 16th century, and a rich institutional outgrowth of agencies, assemblies, chapters, monasteries, and hospitals? Or would it be more like the spare, utilitarian body the National Assembly had hoped to create in 1790? Above all, who would pay for it? The first consul ruled out one potential solution to this problem as a precondition for even starting negotiations. There could be no question of returning any of the church lands confiscated in 1790 and since sold off. The Pope accepted this readily enough, although he was never to concede the legality of the confiscation, any more than that of the annexation of Avignon. With that understood, negotiations could begin in earnest, which they did in November 1800.